Good afternoon. Welcome to today's NAEA pre-election update. Please note that this Zoom webinar is being recorded. My name's Jessica Masters, and I will be the technology moderator if there's any issues. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. To ask questions to the speakers, please use the Q&A box. To ask questions to the moderator or Michelle about NAEA, PAC, any other questions, you can use the chat. Remember, when making a comment to the whole webinar, to choose everyone. If you require closed captioning, please click the Show Captions button on the bottom of your Zoom platform. You may need to hit the More button, which are the three little dots, but that way you can click Closed Captioning to help you out. And that is it from me. I will pass it over to Michelle. So thank you, Michelle. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome all. I understand from Jess, we have quite a large crowd with us this afternoon, which is really great. Before we begin, I'm going to ask Phyllis Jo Kuby, who is with us this afternoon. She's the Vice Chair of the NAEA Political Action Committee, and I've asked Phyllis to make a few remarks about the PAC for us. So Phyllis, off to you.
Thanks, Michelle. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us, especially, it's kind of getting close to that October 15th deadline and lots of other stuff going on. But thank you very much, Michelle and Thad, for including me. I just wanted to say a few words about NAEA PAC and, why it is so important. So first of all, we're in our 18th year, and by supporting members of Congress who are up for re-election and who support us on our issues, we strengthen our collective voice in the public policy process. So that's a really important thing, and it sets us apart from other tax associations. Our NAEA PAC is nonpartisan. We support members of any party who are supportive of enrolled agents in as equal measure as possible based on the composition of the congressional tax writing committees. We do focus our support specifically on incumbent members who serve in leadership positions on the congressional tax writing committees. That's the House Ways and Means and Senate Finance Committees. The myth about PACs is that they buy votes or certain outcomes. Let me assure you, they don't. Our PAC provides access and opportunity to build relationships with the congressional tax writers so that NAEA can make our case for enrolled agents at the right time and to the right people, and that is invaluable. So how do we do this? We don't just mail a check. We do mail a check, but it comes along with attending small fundraising events sponsored by the legislators. And at these events, they're usually pretty small. NAEA's GR team, which will usually be Thad and Michelle, maybe Sam, has the opportunity to interact with legislators, their staff, and also representatives from other organizations and other PACs in attendance. So we can build relationships in a relaxed and informal setting, which sets us up nicely for the actual legislative advocacy work that we will do on Capitol Hill. NAEA PAC is an important advocacy tool NAEA uses to enhance the interests of enrolled agents in the political process. NAEA PAC is also an important tool in raising awareness of EAs. All of those other people that we meet at these events, they go home and they tell their people about enrolled agents. So we raise our profile. The PAC has raised NAEA's profile as a serious player in legislative policymaking. The PAC is supported by the NAEA board and is a key component of NAEA's strategic advocacy planning. All congressional contributions are approved by our 6-member NAEA PAC board. And as NAEA PAC has grown, we've been able to leverage our support by contributing to every member of the House Ways and Means Committee and Senate Finance Committee, the tax writers. With your help, we can do even more. So last year we raised over 100,000. We also increased the number of our contributors, but we need the support of all NAEA members. Your contribution to the NAEA PAC is an investment in promoting and protecting your EA credential. Can you afford a contribution of $50 today that will amplify your voice on Capitol Hill? If so, we welcome that. If you've already contributed, please contribute more. This is an especially important time. You know, we've got an election coming up. We'll have new members on the House Ways and Means and Senate Finance Committees. We want to be well positioned to support them. So as NAEA members, let us show that we are behind the NAEA PAC by coming together to support it. A modest donation from every NAEA member will be a tremendous show of support for this important effort, an effort that reaps rewards for enrolled agents. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Phyllis. That was excellent. Thank you so much. As Jess mentioned, I will be monitoring the Q&A box. So if you have any questions about the PAC, please put them there and we can get back to Phyllis on those. Now I'll turn to our main speaker today, Thad Inge. He's NAEA's Legislative Counsel, and he is Vice President at Vance Quick Associates. So Thad, off to you.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks, Phyllis, and thanks for all the work that that you guys do on the PAC board. I won't reiterate everything she said, but I will say with election season, we've been doing a lot of events, and you really see firsthand some of the benefit, both raising awareness of EAs and what our policy issues are, and building those relationships, not just with the members, but a lot of times they'll have their chiefs of staff at these events, and getting to know them and sharing with them sort of what the priorities are of EA. So really important, and I know that the PAC board does a lot of work to make it happen, and so we appreciate everything that they do. I was saying earlier, whenever it becomes live for some reason, there we go. There's always a pause in switching the slides, but got it to switch there. So as Michelle said, you guys know who I am, I think, or a lot of folks do. And Sam, who's on the line, was instrumental in a lot of the work we do in helping put this deck together. And of course, Michelle. So we're excited to be here with everyone today. Because the election is, I think, now 27 days away, hard to believe. We thought we would focus mainly on the election, where things stand, what some of the implications are, but really just give people a picture of what the key races are, if you're interested in sort of how things might shake out, what states, what seats are really kind of active right now. And then we'll touch on some of the policy implications and also touch on what Congress has on store after the election in November and December. So Sam came up with this: election season, new president, new Congress, oh my. And obviously we've got the presidential race, which is kind of the main show, with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, but also very important election in the Senate and the House, just because both those bodies are very evenly divided. Lots of people up for re-election. In the Senate, Democrats currently hold a 51-49 majority. 23 of the 34 seats up for re-election are Democratic held. So Republicans have an opportunity, a pretty strong opportunity to potentially flip the chamber to Republican control. And then the House, Republicans currently have a slim majority, and there are a lot of sort of moderate districts in play. And so you could, potentially have the reverse there, where Republicans take the Senate and Democrats take the House. The presidential race, as is always the case, there are just a handful of states where this thing will really be decided. You've all been hearing about them in the news recently. You've got Nevada and Arizona out west, Georgia and North Carolina in the southeast, and then Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania are those Midwestern states. Some people are calling them the blue wall, that have decided a lot of the recent elections. And we'll kind of talk through the various states, but all of these are incredibly close. And we included some polling averages in this just to give people a sense. But these are all obviously sort of shifting every day as new polls come out. This has Michigan as 49-47, but there have been some recent polling that has it as a dead tie. So Michigan is expected to be incredibly close and will be very important, for a lot of these states, but I think Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin especially, whoever wins these states will likely be the next president. Pennsylvania, also the latest poll I saw, dead tie. I've spoken to people in Pennsylvania working on campaigns there. They said it is incredibly close between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And a lot of folks think whoever wins Pennsylvania wins the presidency. There is a path, for example, if Kamala Harris were to lose Pennsylvania, there is a path for her to still get the electoral vote she needs. But Pennsylvania is kind of the easiest place. Wisconsin, Dems have had a little bit of an edge, but incredibly close in Wisconsin as well. In Arizona, I think both Arizona and Nevada in recent polls have given Donald Trump a slight edge. And then Georgia and North Carolina have gone back and forth as well. This has Donald Trump with a slight edge in Georgia and North Carolina. So we won't go into all the math of kind of the different scenarios for how the Electoral College, adds up. But these are kind of the key states, along with Nevada, that will likely decide this presidential race. And all of the candidates are spending, both their time, which is one of their most valuable resources at this point, but also money. If you guys live in one of these states and you watch TV, you know that there's a ton of ads being played, a ton of money being spent on the ground. And I think that'll only increase between now and Election Day. So we won't dwell on the presidential because it's kind of a coin flip right now, but did want to talk about the Senate, where Democrats currently have a very narrow majority, 51-49. You'll remember before the last midterm election, it was actually 50-50, and Kamala Harris had broken the tie. So Democrats held the controlling majority in the 50-50 Senate. Democrats picked up a seat in the midterms, and so it's been 51-49. The Senate is famous, as I know we've talked about before. You really need 60 votes to get a lot done because of the filibuster and the way cloture works. It really is set up for compromise. And so if you don't have 60 votes, one senator can really, clam things up and gum things up in the Senate. But whoever has the majority obviously controls the leadership in terms of setting the agenda. The majority leader has a lot of control about what goes onto the floor, what legislation gets voted on, and then also the committee chairs, who is controlling the various committees. NAEA has a great relationship with both Senator Wyden, who's currently the chair of the Finance Committee, and with Senator Crapo, who's the ranking member. So we're well positioned either way, but there will be implications. And then when it comes to something like tax reform, there is the procedure known as reconciliation, which allows on certain budget bills, bills that have a budget impact, for you to pass legislation, for the Senate to pass legislation with just a simple majority. That was used on tax reform back in 2017, the Trump tax cuts. It was also used when they passed the Inflation Reduction Act a couple of years ago. So, you know, there are sort of real implications for tax reform moving forward in terms of who has the Senate and also who's sort of controlling the committees, writing the bills, that kind of thing. Although we expect there will be a fair amount of compromise going into it regardless. So looking at some of the races, as I mentioned at the top, a lot more Democrats are up for re-election, either retiring or just have races. And so it is a difficult map on the Democratic side, and things are kind of looking better for Republicans in terms of taking control. And we'll walk through some of the states, but if you see the map, you know, these are kind of spread across the country. But we're going to walk through some of the specific ones. The first one, West Virginia. So I talked about the 50-50 Senate. Everyone remembers the sort of outsized role that Senator Manchin from West Virginia played when there was a 50-50 Senate. He's a moderate to conservative Democrat. His state, West Virginia, is very Republican. And so he liked to play that middle position and sort of, you know, influence legislation, keep everybody on their toes. He did that a lot with the 50-50 Senate, and always said he was representing his state, wanted common sense, moderate positions. Well, he was up for re-election this year. Jim Justice, the governor of West Virginia, who has a long history there as a billionaire coal magnate, owns various hotels in and around the state. He announced he was running against Manchin. Manchin ended up deciding not to run. When you look at sort of the electoral history of that state, Donald Trump won West Virginia by more than any state except for, I think, Wyoming. And so that's going to be a clearly Republican state. Governor Justice is expected to win. And so pretty much both parties have already agreed, excuse me, that state will be Republican moving forward. And so that's one of the seats that Republicans need to get to a 50-50. There's, I'd say, next in line in terms of a difficult race for Democrats is John Tester in Montana. John Tester is long been popular in Montana, but has always had tough races. He's a farmer, someone that really relates well to the people of Montana. But that's another state that has trended Republican, that goes very Republican in the presidential race. So it's a tough year for John Tester to be up for re-election. And a guy named Tim Sheehy is running against him. I think most of the polls have John Tester down by a few points. It's not that he cannot win. He does have a history of pulling off really tough races. But that's one folks are watching very closely to see. And if West Virginia and Montana went Republican and everything else stayed the same, Republicans would take the majority in the Senate. The next race that is very closely watched is Ohio. So Senator Sherrod Brown, a Democrat from Ohio, is up for re-election. He is a strong candidate in that he's a pretty progressive liberal senator, but he has strong ties to unions, to blue collar workers, and so has always fared really well in Ohio. Ohio has trended Republican in recent years. I think Trump might have won it by more than 10 points 4 years ago. And so the Sherrod Brown is expected to definitely outperform the Democratic ticket. But one question is, how big is the Republican sort of presidential win in Ohio? And is it too much for Sherrod Brown to overcome to keep his seat? I think most of the polls do have Sherrod Brown up by a couple of points. So he might be the slight favorite, but a lot of it will depend on the presidential race and how that kind of shakes out. Three other states that we wanted to highlight. One, Pennsylvania. Obviously, Pennsylvania is extremely tight in the presidential race. It is probably, if you had to pick one state to say that it's the most important for who wins the presidential campaign, most folks would probably pick Pennsylvania. There's also a Senate race there. You've got Bob Casey, who's a member of the Senate Finance Committee. And by the way, Sherrod Brown is also a member of the Senate Finance Committee. He is up against Dave McCormick. Dave McCormick ran last time. He's a hedge fund. I don't know if he's a billionaire, but hundreds of millionaire. And has gotten some heat. He's from Pennsylvania, but had traditionally lived in Connecticut and had a place in Pennsylvania. But he ran 2 years ago, lost to Dr. Oz in the Republican primary, who went on to lose to Fetterman. But he's back again. He's running against Bob Casey. They are spending, huge amounts of money, similar to in Pennsylvania. In Ohio. I read that in Ohio, I think the Republican ticket has spent over $100 million, and the Democratic ticket, it's been like 80 million. So it's huge amounts of money going into these races. But Bob Casey is a well-liked incumbent. He's known as being moderate, and so they're battling it out. The expectation is that Bob Casey will run a few points better than Kamala Harris. And so if it's a dead tie, let's say in the presidential race in Pennsylvania, Bob Casey would probably pull that out. But if Trump were to win by a few points, it would be a lot harder for Senator Casey. So we'll have to see how it shakes out, but it will be very close. Wisconsin, another swing state that also has a Senate race. Senator Tammy Baldwin is up for re-election. I think she's currently a few points ahead of the Republican, but that's still going to be a tight race. And then in Nevada, Senator Jackie Rosen is running against Sam Brown, and she's an incumbent senator that this is just her end of her first term, so she's been in for 6 years, and that is going to be a close race just because Nevada is such a hotbed in the presidential race, and it'll be similar in the Senate race. Michelle, you got any questions?
Can we flip back to Ohio for a moment? The question is the talk about Ohio and the Haitians affecting the Senate race.
That's a great question. I know it's been a big national topic. Obviously, it was referenced in the vice presidential debate. I have not followed it closely enough to know sort of how it's played into the Senate race. I'm sure it potentially has been a factor. I know that one of the main stories coming out of Ohio in the last couple of weeks that had nothing to do with taxes, but what was a big political story was Bernie Moreno had spoken out on abortion and basically said, why would any woman over 45 or 50 care about abortion, and had that it doesn't impact them. And so he had gotten a lot of heat over that. And I know Sherrod Brown had made a big deal out of that. So there are some hot button issues that are getting a lot of attention there, and the Haitian immigrant issue is probably one of them, but don't want to say for sure. And a few more states, and I wanted to break these down because I think the Senate races are more interesting in terms of, they really reflect sort of the cultures of the states and where things stand in the political environment, and have more overlay with the presidential race, especially in these swing states where there's a lot of overlap this year. And then if folks are from these states, they can relate to it. It's a little harder in the House where you have 435 races to go through the individual races. And so that's why we thought we would break it out like this and just kind of walk through some of the states. And so hope folks find this interesting. In Michigan, another swing state, obviously, Senator Debbie Stabenow is retiring. And so it's an open seat. And you've got Alyssa Slotkin, who's a moderate Democrat, current Congresswoman, is running against Mike Rogers, who is a former congressman who used to head the Intelligence Committee, well respected in foreign policy circles. They're running against each other. I think Alyssa Slotkin probably has the edge. And then in Arizona, you've Kyrsten Sinema, who was sort of like a Joe Manchin. Kyrsten Sinema, who's now an independent, is very moderate. You never knew if she was going to vote with Republicans or Democrats. She played an influential role in the whole Build Back Better, which eventually became the Inflation Reduction Act, similar to Senator Manchin. She was in trouble in her primary. Ruben Gallego had said he was going to run against her in the Democratic primary. She became an independent, but it was unclear whether she was going to run as an independent. And she decided to retire. And so she is running against Carrie Lake, or Ruben Gallego, who is the Democratic nominee now, is running against Carrie Lake, who famously lost a couple of years ago. I believe it was the governor's race, and had made a big deal out of sort of the election being fraudulent, that kind of thing. And she is back, and that is a close race. I think Gallego probably has the edge in that race, even though Arizona is expected to go, or Trump has I wouldn't say expected to go Republican, the presidential, but he might have a slight edge there. But I think Ruben Gallego is running ahead of Kamala Harris, but will regardless be a close race that we're watching closely. And then I wanted to mention Maryland. So Ben Cardin, someone that NAEA has worked with a lot over the years, he did a lot of tax administration bills, worked closely with Senator Portman from Ohio, who retired 2 years ago. But Senator Cardin, unfortunately, announced he was retiring, created an open seat in Maryland. Maryland is traditionally a Democratic state, but it has had Republicans elected throughout the years. Most recently, Larry Hogan was the Republican governor of Maryland before Wes Moore took over a couple of years ago. And they had been trying to recruit Larry Hogan to run for Senate for a long time. He's considered moderate, well-liked on both sides of the aisle. And they finally convinced him. So Larry Hogan is the Republican nominee. And then Angela also Brooks is the Democrat. She's a leader in Prince George's County, outside of DC, here in Maryland, or in Maryland. And so this is a race that should be a Democratic victory, just based on the state, based on how Kamala Harris is expected to, easily beat Donald Trump there. But because you have this former governor that appeals to folks on both sides of the aisle, there is this outside chance that you could have Larry Hogan win that race. A lot of Republicans are very excited about his candidacy. So it's another one we're watching. And a few more states that are a little more long shots, but are are interesting and could have an outside chance of flipping. One is Florida. So Senator Rick Scott, former governor who's been senator for a while, is up for re-election. Debbie Muscarell Powell is, and I might have mispronounced her last name, but is running against him. She is a former congresswoman. She actually lost, I believe it was last election, but is running against him, and I think he has the edge. But a lot of folks are saying her campaign has been surprisingly strong, or just the Democratic response has been surprisingly strong. And also that the presidential, and Florida used to be the 50-50 state, obviously, with Gore v. Bush and everything that followed sort of immediately after. In recent, the last 10 years or 15 years, it's really trended more Republican. But there are some polls that show it tightening up a little bit between Trump and Kamala Harris. And so the Senate race might also be a reflection of that. In Texas, definitely a traditionally Republican state that there has been talk about, is it becoming more purple? Senator Ted Cruz, who has a lot of strong supporters, but also a lot of detractors just because of his strong politics, is running against Colin Allred, who's a very dynamic candidate and has gotten some traction. I think most people would still give Senator Cruz the edge, but there is, the outside chance that Colin Allred could give him a run for his money there. And then Nebraska is another sort of sleeper that is surprisingly close. Senator Deb Fischer is being challenged by Dan Osborne. He's got an interesting bio and is a strong candidate, and is scaring her folks a little bit. So those are some races that weren't expected to flip, but that folks are now paying a little more attention to. And this is just an interesting, tidbit that we thought we would share. With the polarization of government and with things becoming more divisive, most states have senators from the same party. In Florida, you've got Rick Scott and Marco Rubio. In New York, you've got Schumer and Gillibrand. And so there's fewer and fewer states that have representation from both parties. The states that do have it this year have tough Senate races. So Montana with John Tester and Steve Daines. Obviously, John Tester's got a tough race. Wisconsin with Tammy Baldwin and Ron Johnson. Tammy Baldwin is up for re-election. Maine, a little less competitive. You've got Angus King as the independent, but caucuses with the Democrats. Ohio, obviously with Sherrod Brown and J.D. Vance. And then in West Virginia, where you've got Manchin now retiring. And so I think after this election, we will see fewer of these states. Certainly with West Virginia, we'll see how the other ones shake out, if they maintain representation from both parties or not. Michelle, before I move on to the House stuff, any questions?
No questions at the moment, Thad.
All right. So this is just my Senate prediction based on the map, based on the current polling. I think it will flip to Republican with a narrow majority, probably 51 or 52 seats. Of course, anything is possible on election night, but based on sort of where things stand, we think that it will likely go narrowly Republican. So the House has been historically close. It does when you see 220 to 211, it doesn't always look as close as it is, but it really just takes a few people to switch from one side to the other to sway a vote. And that has caused, issues over the last 2 years in terms of being able to get legislation through, in terms of their leadership. Obviously, we saw McCarthy, get thrown out and new Speaker Johnson come in. A lot of times on these tough appropriations bills or debt ceiling or other issues, Republicans have had to rely on Democratic votes to get things through, just because of the conservative faction of the Republican Party does not like to vote for a lot of things like spending measures or other types of bills. So it's been, very tight, which has made governing hard. And I think going into the next Congress, we expect it to remain pretty tight. Democrats are narrowing in on 20 seats that could send them to the majority. Some of the states that have a lot of seats are California, Michigan, New York. And Republicans are also looking at some pickup opportunities, but really they're on defense. They're trying to maintain the majority. Some of these moderate districts in places where Biden won 4 years ago, like New York and California, they're trying to hold on to those seats to make sure they maintain their majority. I will also say there's some newly drawn, because it was a census year, or the new census maps have started to come out from the last census. There are some newly drawn districts. For example, there's one in Alabama where they're creating an additional potential Democratic district with the majority-minority district. That one will likely go Democratic, which would be a pickup for Democrats. There's a similar seat in Louisiana that could potentially go Democratic. So in addition to some of these really close districts, there's some newly drawn districts that could shake up the map a little bit. So here's just a snapshot of some of the closest races. Under a point or under 2 points of difference. And on both sides of the aisle, in terms of incumbents, facing tough challenges. And so I think with the House, it'll really depend on how things look like on election night. What's turnout? Is there a strong Democratic turnout? Is there a strong Republican turnout? What happens at the top of the ticket? Is there a presidential race that kind of does better than expected? Because that could have a big sway in this. But regardless, we expect it to be very tight in the House. So this is the slide I made a few tweaks to the one that went out, just in terms of how I phrased it. But if I had to predict today, and don't hold me to it, but I thought I would share a prediction, I would give Democrats a very slight edge to win the majority in the House. Just the way the map falls and the fact that it is so close, I think that there's a good chance that they could pick up the seats they need. However, I'll also say that, you could see this, whoever wins the White House winning the House, because it is sort of a reflection of that popular vote, and things are so close that if, for example, Donald Trump beat expectations and won the White House by a couple of points, you could see the House following way. But I also think there's a scenario where Trump could win and the House would go Democratic, just because it is also close. I think if Kamala Harris wins, the House will likely go Democratic. So that's just reading the tea leaves. Of course, it'll shift between now and Election Day, but I think that's kind of where things stand today. So this just laid out some different scenarios about the breakdown of having united government versus, divided government. And I would say before Biden got out of the race, a lot of Republicans were feeling bullish about taking the Senate, the House, and the White House. That has died down with some of the excitement around Kamala Harris. The two high scenarios that are ranked here are having a Republican president, a Democratic House, and a Republican Senate. So sort of the one potential that I outlined on the last slide, or having a Democratic president, Democratic House, and Republican Senate. As you'll see, both the medium and highs have a strong likelihood that you have a Republican Senate, which I think is correct. But the White House is probably the most flip of the coin, and then the House could also go either way. As you get down to kind of the very low scenarios, I will say on this medium one that has all Republican control, if that was the case, that one area that would really impact is tax reform, because Republicans have said if they win control of everything, they want to pass a tax bill very quickly, and that they would use reconciliation in the Senate. They could do that with zero Democratic votes in the House and the Senate if they stayed unified as a party. And so that's an area that you would see a real impact. I do think there would still be a lot of debate within the Republican Party about how much do they spend, are these tax cuts paid for, what is the impact on the deficit? And so I think there could be a lot of internal wrangling if that was the situation. But I really think we'll probably end up with some kind of divided government, which means it'll have to be a compromise. No one party will be able to jam anything through. And, if you have either a Democratic House or White House or both, it'll require some real compromise with a Republican Senate. So that kind of leads into some of the policy implications. First on leadership, I kind of touched on this, but whenever you have a new Congress, you often have some kind of leadership shakeup, but especially if you switch control of which party's controlling it. This year we're going to have one regardless in the Senate, because Mitch McConnell has already announced he's stepping down as leader, as Republican leader. John Thune, John Cornyn, Rick Scott have all put their hat in the ring. I think Rick Scott has formally. He ran against McConnell last time around, didn't get a lot of votes. But Thune and Cornyn are kind of seen as the two front runners. Thune probably has a slight edge. They're both on Finance Committee. We work both close with both of those offices. And then on the Democratic side, Schumer's expected to stay in charge, so not as much change there, but you do have Debbie Stabenow, who's retiring, who was in leadership. And then on the House, I think the House is harder to predict. If Republicans lose the majority, Speaker Johnson is probably in trouble. If they maintain the majority, I think he'd probably keep his seat. But Jim Jordan has been making noise about running if they lose. And then on the Democratic side, last Congress or this Congress, we had this new leadership come in with Jeffries, Catherine Clark, and I think that would stay regardless of whether they're majority or minority next time around.
We have a question, Thad.
Okay, sounds good.
Based on your predictions,
Yep.
What are the implications for enrolled agents and for our policy priorities?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the good thing is on some of the things we're working on, like minimum standards for tax preparers, we are currently doing that on a bipartisan basis, especially in the Senate. We've got Senator Crapo and Senator Wyden working on a bill that is bipartisan. The House, we've been working to get some more Republican support. We've had strong Democratic support. And so our plan is to keep moving forward with that and pushing it as a bipartisan solution, regardless of who wins. I think in terms of what the committee's priorities are and what legislation is tax legislation is moving next year, it will have some implications. I tend to think a divided government would probably be preferable because, well, first of all, it's highly unlikely we're going to have a Democratic control. That some of our issues, like minimum standards for tax preparers, have had more support among Democrats, but they also are common sense, and a lot of Republicans appreciate them. And so I think that if we have a divided government, we'll be able to keep making that case for a bipartisan solution. If it's complete Republican control, Republicans or Democrats won't be able to force that as much as a compromise issue. And I could see there being other priorities sort of for reconciliation, for sort of pushing through other tax priorities. And so that's a long-winded way of saying we're going to stay the course regardless. I don't want to say one would be better than the other, but it definitely will have some implications if folks like Senator Wyden, who's really been pushing for some of our issues, didn't have as strong a seat at the table. So I'll get into a couple of these. Looking at the clock, we still have some time. A couple of these issues, there's obviously, NAEA priorities, things like minimum standards for tax preparers, math error notices, modernization at the IRS, having better tools for customer service, funding the IRS. And I will say, if there was complete Republican control, funding the IRS could really be at risk. And the now $50 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act started as $80 billion. That could be at risk. And so that's something we're watching closely, but we're hoping that money doesn't go away. But kind of beyond some of those core tax administrative issues, there's also just the various tax provisions that will impact all of your customers are really going to be at play, next year. Former President Trump has said he'd like to extend tax cuts from 2017, eliminate a lot of the climate tax credits that came out in the Inflation Reduction Act. He would either keep or reduce the corporate tax rate that went down to 21% in 2017, and has proposed, and I think this might be on another slide. Let's see. Yeah, so I'll get to the other stuff. So if there was a Democratic sweep, which we don't expect, Kamala Harris has said she would extend tax cuts for taxpayers under $400,000, but let those above that expire, expand the child tax credit, raise taxes on corporations and high income taxpayers. For corporations, her proposal is said taking the corporate rate from 21 to 28%, which is what Biden has proposed in the past, and then letting the cuts for for anyone over 400,000 expire, and then potentially eliminate the capital and SALT deduction. I don't know if she's formally come out for that, but generally Democrats have supported that with New York and California and Illinois being so impacted by that. And so, if it's a divided government, I think it'll be a back and forth. I think each side will have to give and take a little bit. Here are some of the other items on their tax agenda. What I was going to mention before, and I'll just hit on it. President Trump has come out for a lot of tax breaks in recent weeks. Those would be extremely expensive, and just a few in taxes on overtime work, in taxes on tips, and ending taxes on Social Security benefits. I think the total cost of that combined with the other stuff would be like $11 trillion. And so we don't expect all of that stuff. It's just not sustainable that all that would get passed. But interestingly, when the in taxes on tips came out, it was sort of seen as a campaign gimmick that couldn't work. But then Kamala Harris soon after came out and proposed the same thing. And so both candidates are saying that we should eliminate taxes on tips. That plays very well in Nevada, where there's a close election. And then Kamala Harris has come out for some pretty aggressive tax credits around both the child tax credit, for instance, giving credit for newborns, a $6,000 credit for newborns as part of the child tax credit, but also on small businesses. So giving new small businesses a tax credit of up to $50,000. I think right now it's $5,000. So it would be increasing that around tenfold, and also creating a new tax credit for first-time home buyers. Of course, any of these proposals, I know it goes without saying, but any of these proposals would have to be passed by Congress and would likely be a negotiation with Congress. So no candidates and to get everything they want, but they will have a lot of sway when it comes to tax reform because they will be signing the bill, they will have a seat at the table, and they have the power to veto. But just based on dollars and cents, and also just the nature of the negotiation, none of these candidates are going to be able to get all this stuff.
Okay, Thad, tell me, what's your intelligence on dropping the state and local tax cap?
So great question. So that's another one that Trump recently came out and said, I think he was in Long Island in New York speaking, and he recently said he was for eliminating the cap. So, there were several attempts last Congress. Most of them, or this Congress, most of them were not to completely eliminate it, but were to significantly increase it. I think one had it going up to 60,000 from its current, I think it's at 10,000 now, so the cap would be raised to 60,000. There are a couple of political factors here. One is it's really expensive. This is kind of what paid for a lot of the Trump tax cuts in 2017 by adding this cap. Two, it tends to favor wealthy people in states like New York, New Jersey, California. And so a lot of folks like Jason Smith from Missouri, the chairman of the Ways and Means, is like, my folks don't care about this. We don't have high tax, high state and local taxes, and they're not as impacted by this. So it is tough politically. The one thing that folks advocating for it to go away really have in their favor is it automatically expires at the end of next year. And so if nothing is done, it will go away. We all expect there to be some kind of tax bill next year. This will be part of those negotiations. I imagine, if I had to predict, they would keep the tax, but have the threshold go up, have the cap go up. But where they draw that line is not exactly clear. And this will be a battle for sure. And on both sides of the aisle, you've got moderate Republicans that have been advocating to get rid of this, and lots of Democrats as well. So it's one of those it's like in the old days when geography was more important than political party. You had the Western senators teaming up with the Southern senators, and then you had the Northeastern senators in their camp. This is one of those issues that can break through party lines and be more about geography and constituents who you represent.
We have a question about CTC. I'm guessing that's child tax credit.
Yep.
Did both parties mention raising CTC, but when it came up before Congress, many GOP voted no, including Senator Rubio. It seems that even when they agree, it depends on whose bill is being discussed. So will you expect that to continue?
It's a great point. I was hesitant to even have that in there, that Trump supported CTC. It is something that he has supported in the past. Ivanka Trump last administration had been a big advocate for increasing the CTC. You've got some moderate members, like Romney was one who's retiring, but he had been a big advocate for increasing the CTC because it really helps to deal with child poverty. And so that is seen sort of across the across the aisle is a good thing. Republicans will tell you the devil's in the details. And so there were things that, you know, some people talk about work requirements or the size of the increase or kind of how it's structured. And Crapo, who I think really just didn't want that bill to pass, but he had, you know, he had really made the case to Senate Republicans that there needed to be tweaks, needed to be done differently. We can't pass it this way. And so that led to, you know, them not being able to get enough Republican support. And so how that plays out during tax reform, it's a great question, but it'll continue to be a football.
And one last word on the SALT cap. A plea from members to at least remove the marriage penalty.
Yeah, sounds good. That is one that I think will definitely be debated, you know, next year a lot. Let me see if we have any other slides. This is on corporate taxes. I mean, I think we already touched on this a little bit, but Harris would raise it to 28%, and Trump has said 21% or even maybe cut it to 15%. This is one that obviously it has real impact. It's also very political because it's easy for you know, either side to kind of make political arguments around it. It was 35% before 2017. Everybody agreed that was too high, but the question is how you draw the line. And even some Republicans have said, well, if we're gonna do all this other stuff, we should raise it a little bit. So we'll have to see how that one shakes out. All right, just real quick, I forgot I had lame duck in here. Congress will be back after the election for 3 weeks. The budget is expiring on December 20th. They were able to pass a CR at the end of September to get that passed through the 20th. And so they've got to pass a budget deal or some kind of extension, but likely a bill before the 20th. The question is, how big is that vehicle? What gets included? Does it have any tax provisions? Probably not, but there is a chance. There's some disaster tax provisions that were part of the Wyden-Smith package that could potentially get added. And here's a slide. Any hope for the tax bill? You know, I would say slim possibility, but we'll have to see what the appetite is to get something done before the new year after the election. Do they want to clear the decks, get some of this stuff done so they start with a more fresh slate when they enter the craziness of next year and all the tax issues? That's unclear at this point. So I will leave it at that. Sorry if I went a little fast there at the end, Michelle, but.
No, thank you, Thad. I hope you all will join us on November 19th when we see how Thad's predictions play out. We'll be having a webinar on the election update. And also, Phyllis, thank you so much for your remarks about the PAC. We've just published a new PAC newsletter called PAC Chat. It'll be a quarterly publication. Hope you all read it, and if you haven't, please do. And the PAC will be hosting an event, a virtual event with a couple of members of Congress on December 3rd. We don't know who our congressional guests are yet. We're still waiting for confirmations, but we'll probably have 2 congressional guests for that event. So Phyllis, any last words from you?
My last words are always the same. Please donate to the PAC. It's so important.
Thank you all. We appreciate your attention today and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Stay safe.